Hello, everyone.
I think our microphone's off.
No, we're on.
Are we? Yeah. Hi, everyone.
How are we all doing?
Oh, yes. Can you hear me? Yes.
I'll give another couple of seconds for all the stragglers to join in. Last second. Howdy, howdy, howdy.
Howdy, howdy, ho.
Yeah, we're just gonna wait. I've seen. I know a couple of people are gonna be waiting in the audience anyway. But again, I'll just wait another minute before we get chatting. Hold on, I'm gonna give you a little cowboy hat reaction for saying howdy. There you go. There we go.
You did it twice. Oh.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone else is coming yet.
Yeah. People are coming.
Oh, we got a couple more.
Should we start and then if they come up, or do you want to leave a little bit?
Yeah, no, we can start. Tom just went. It's fine. So I think everyone here has been here before. But for anyone that hasn't been here before, it's the same as we've always done it. It's just we're gonna just start speaking casually. If you want to come into the chat, then we can jump on the stage and whatnot. If you just want to stay in the audience and listen, you can. There are like requests to talk, but I know that it's like it just keeps picking up. So if you want to just get on the stage, if you can jump on. If you just want to stay in the audience, that's fine. Give it a go now if you want to jump on. If anyone's got something to say, I know we do have a resident Faulkner aficionado in the crowd. I know he knows who I'm speaking about, but we can just get it started. So if anyone wants to come on the stage and we can kickstart the conversation, feel free. You can jump on, see if the requests work or not as well. Because if you can't jump on, I can just bring you on right away.
Yeah, just put something in the chat if you're struggling to jump in. We can start talking about it anyway.
Or maybe we should just start talking about it.
Yes. I love this book. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I actually didn't thought that the different perspectives upset me. If anything, they enriched the narrative by a lot. And the overall experience of reading the book. How did you thought about?
Well, I'd never read the book before, and the thing is, it's like my experience of it at the beginning was that when you learn, I feel like the first 40 pages, the first act or so, I actually thought that it was a very beautiful story. And I assumed that what it was going to be was just going to be about this meditation on death, which I still believe is a big part of it.
Yeah.
But I thought that this idea of the change of perspectives, which is like the crux of what most people are going to talk about of the novel, is the structure of it. I felt as though what it was going to be as though my initial experience of it was these changes in perspective is just Faulkner attempting to grab the totality of what it means to encounter death. It's something that we will never comprehend because the moment that we experience it is the moment we can't relay the information to anyone else. And so there is no right and wrong answer of how we experience it. And these different perspectives of grief, these different perspectives of these streams of consciousness of when you encounter trauma. Because at the beginning they describe like Nancy Bundren dying as being not as though because Dahl says that near the beginning. He says Nancy is dying, and he repeats it in a way that it's not that she is dying, but that the concept of her, everything that she represents, that motherhood itself is dying. That it's this grand total thing. But then as it goes on, it brings it in the same way like Blood Meridian does. It's like it talks about the transcendental and it talks about the material, because you realize that there comes a point in life when no matter what your internal world is, you start to become an incredibly selfish and self-absorbed person because the things that ultimately matter to you end up taking over everything. And so the rest of the novel becomes this thing where we're following all of these varying characters' reasons for why they're doing what they're doing, and none of them seem to be meaningful enough that it can be reasonably be justified them doing what they did, of like carrying Ansi through the American South and whatnot.
Yeah. I think Anse is the character that the father, that you can see that more clearly. I think like his story structure as someone that is absolutely selfish. But I do agree. I actually think that although the book is divided in these different perspectives, the characters rub on each other constantly, and you still feel this idea of sometimes you see the same scene playing out from different perspectives and repeated in different times.
Yeah, like one scene will play out like over the course of 3 chapters, and the plot won't progress past that point.
Exactly, yeah, but you still feel like a sense of the emotional reality of the characters is almost more important than the actions itself. And I think I think this is purposeful in the book, that Drew, how do you pronounce his name? Drew, yeah. He's the character, for me, the most important character.
Really?
The way I read the book, he was so important. He only has one chapter about him from his perspective, but I think he's instrumental to glue the whole idea of who Adi was. We can get into that after, because I wrote down some stuff about the symbolism of the horses and the motherhood, and anyway, but I don't want to jump into before the conversation gets good between the members as well. But I do think that I wrote down so many things about him, because we get such a big understanding of who he is from everyone else talking about him, and I think that is so interesting, because everyone in a way is relaying their own emotions. And I think the person that is perhaps the most important to that story is the one that is voiceless. And it's interesting because the only chapter that he shows up is right in the beginning. He's talking about is it Cash that's building the...
Cash is the one that builds the coffin.
Yeah, he's talking about how Cash is building the coffin right underneath Addie's room.
From the window so she can
From the window, sorry, from the window where she can see. And after she passes away, it's almost... He goes mute. Like, we don't hear his voice in the book from the perspective of like the narrative, you know, but we see his actions through the other characters playing out and thinking about him. And I really, really like that. I think this is a great device that Faulkner uses to really, really drive the point across of this idea of the transformational part of death, but also the chaos and the alienation that happens in the family itself, right? The structure of the family.
Let me ask you something.
Yeah.
What do you think? Like a basic summarization. I think that the main because I came to you once I've read it and I said I feel as though you can, when you're reading any novel, you read through it, and especially if you're reading through it at the same time as someone, you discuss your journey as you're going along with it. And I came to you and I said I think that this novel, more than many off the top of my head, more than many that I can think of, that upon reading the final sentence of this novel, I think the entire conversation around the novel changes. I think it changes completely, because I think, yes, discussing the novel as you're going along and dissecting it chapter by chapter, and I mean, if you were to take there's 15 characters, but there's ultimately like 7 or 8 that we follow recurrently.
Yeah.
But you can take each one of those, you can dissect them, play them out chronologically, and you have these 7 or 8 small narratives that are occurring as part of a total thing. But I think that once you've read that final sentence and you see the totality of it all, I think that completely justifies the structure of the novel. And I think the structure of the novel as this... Some people would describe it as a postmodernist work. But we were speaking about it, and it's a very modernist work, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But I think that the structure is the thing that when people talk about Faulkner, or when people talk about this work, that's going to be the main thing. They might not even speak about the plot as much. They might not even speak about the character as much. I think this idea of the stream of consciousness and the jumping back and forth, because it's something that people also find difficult, and I know that people were also talking about it here, that the idea of following the characters and not quite sure who's saying what or the perspective of a single action, who it's coming from.
I suppose...
It's okay. I personally think that the major success of the novel within this structure is that I find that every character has a very distinct voice.
Yes, absolutely. I felt the same.
But I just want to ask you dead quick.
Yeah.
How do you vision this structure? Because I've got my own thing about I don't want to yap on constantly, but I find the structure very, very obviously important, but not just important. I think it's incredibly successful in what it does.
Yes. First,
Forrest said, "I'm here." Don't worry. Yeah. Again, by the way, like we can keep talking. If you all want to listen, that's fine. But if you want to come in, you can all either barge in or do the
Hey, if
request.
you just want to say something on chat as well, I can just
Yeah,
read it
yeah,
out loud.
whatever.
But what's the question?
Just about the structure because
Yes, okay, I have points. I think fundamental aspect of the structure. Okay, it's easy to get bogged down and think that the structure is only serving the purpose of confusing the reader. Yeah,
yes,
but I actually think it's doing the opposite. I think it's clarifying the main point of the novel. As this constant dynamic between being a family member, being an insider and an outsider, right? The feeling of alienation. As I said, the characters do rub on each other. Even though the chapters feel isolated, there's always this constant dynamic of push and pull between characters. They never feel they never feel like a family, you know?
do you not think?
In so many ways they never feel like a family.
I get it because there is like this constant conflict where you realize that everyone has their own individual reasoning for doing so, and it's like their own personal world start to take over this idea
Yeah.
that Addie's even dead.
Yeah, and it's hard enough sometimes to follow. I mean, I thought the book was actually quite forgiving and not that difficult to read as people were saying. I mean, I understand why people find it difficult, but once you start understanding the voice of each character, and I think Faulkner uses some tools to help us understand the characters. Not only the voices are completely different, but also there's points of recognition of, like, you have Joe with his horse, you have the tools of certain characters, you have a character that is constantly talking about certain elements, and he will bring those thematic elements constantly, not only the voice.
I can see here.
Yes.
Brian said it took me a while to figure out they were a family. Edward liked the structure, but thought it was difficult. Joe says he'll reread it. I definitely think it's one that requires rereads.
Yes, it does.
But Forrest, we invited you in, our Faulkner aficionado, so
Yay.
take the floor.
If you want.
It's an honor to speak on behalf of my favorite American writer. Um, so like just as a preface, also what you guys are saying is it's pretty much Faulkner's bread and butter. It's what made him famous is like his ability to capture these different voices, this stream of consciousness, and this way of telling a story. But his stories always involve these dynamic characters with like very, very visceral emotions. That's what I like about it is that everybody you know who they are emotionally before logically, I suppose. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's a bit challenging at the beginning because Faulkner, but it's a good thing, right? He doesn't hold your hand.
Yeah.
Thing is revealed without context, and then the context comes later. Sometimes the context you have to like put it together. They're very much puzzle books. Some of them more complicated than others. Like for example, Light in August is probably his most accessible book, but still has this. I actually think As I Lay Dying is one of his more difficult books, although people seem to say that it's accessible. Whereas people say Absalom, Absalom, my favorite, is like his least accessible. Whereas I think it's actually way easier than As I Lay Dying. And I think the first thing in any Faulkner book that like my mind is instantly like sort of wandering to is number one, he kind of what you guys are getting at. It's more prevalent in others, not so much here, but he loves to subvert any sort of classical trope, any sort of these like classical archetypes. And one of the things that As I Lay Dying is about is you get sort of the hints, right? That like when Addie is buried, they take her eyes out, like she's Oedipus, right? Like she's
Yeah.
blind to her fate, to her tragedy. And um th- the other thing is that whole like modern postmodern distinction that he's in. It is a very modernist book. I think where you get the postmodernity is in like the last line, but
Yeah.
the most important thing is that there's always a story of America in his writing. There's something somewhere in the American South. There's something cultural and sociological. This book uh, does not have a prevalence of especially whites and blacks living in the same place, like some of his others do, but the
Mhm.
family and what you're saying, and the family and their emotions and their priorities, um, and like this is the real meat and potatoes of the book. That this family, Darrell, for being so, I guess, someone who they think is one of the most precocious children, Darrell is essentially a criminal. You know what I mean? He's queer and he's insane. He's the modern world's idea of what would you call, like, a vagrant, a
Yeah.
Yeah.
vagabond, with his family. And Jewel, kind of like what you're saying. I think Jewel is one of the most fascinating characters in the story as well, just because Jewel seems like someone who is so will driven, and part of the reason you realize that is that he's not his dad's son.
Yes.
Jewel wants what he wants. He's taking charge. He's like a real, like, masculine figure. And
Yeah.
Cash is like a builder of things. Um and then Ans is just like an idiot. But Ans is almost like this tragic figure that, right, like he can never see what's right in front of him. Even at the end of the book, what he does is like, that's a glaring insult. How do you think his family's going to react to Mrs. Budgeon
Yeah.
after this journey just happened? You know what I mean? He can't
Yeah.
help himself.
Yeah.
And I think,
I
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Talk about like this idea of constant subversion, because ultimately, when we think, like, if you were to think, okay, we have a consortium of characters that need to get to a specific location. It's a very classic
It's
tale.
an odyssey for Addie as well. Go ahead.
Exactly, and even the fact, like, because he took the quote "as I lay dying" from Homer initially.
Agamemnon.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so there's like that obvious subversion that's going on. But what's interesting is because you have all of these individual tales, and however they're supposed to reach the reason that they're doing it as any kind of turn of heroism, like the idea of Cash losing the ability to walk. By the end, everything becomes meaningless by that last line, and it's just like this a really obvious subversion that he's doing of plot. And because, like what you said, this idea of, there is, as you're reading it, there's no context given to anything, because at the same time, how do you give context to this? There's like a rich poetic world inside of these characters, and that's
Right.
ultimately the thing that we're experiencing more than anything, because the plot of getting Addie from one point to the other, by the end, it's just it's been neglected for essentially 2/3 of the story, to the point that, like, Faulkner has to bring Addie back in to give context to, oh yeah, don't forget she's still here, that everyone else has forgotten, and then by the end she's just been replaced by someone else. It's just it. I mean, I'm inclined to believe that, like, Faulkner is really actively trying to subvert rather than just doing it in a passive sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I
Right.
think with Dar, you can really see that as well because he starts as this very eloquent, poetic character. You really get a sense of the real subjectivity of a person, like a fully formed individual. And then by the end, he suffers this like chiasms in which you see like the complete inversion of the character, right? Like, he's absolutely now a new person. At least the way I see it, as I feel like first you said something, you used the term visceral, and I wrote it down here while you're saying.
Yeah.
I really do think that it's very easy when you're deconstructing things, especially in literature, to come across as experimental. And because of his command of the word, in none aspect of this, you feel like it's an experiment. You always feel like he's inventing, almost like he's inventing language as you read. At least I thought that constantly, you know.
Hmm.
Um, and this is a more than anything, I see it as a character study. And one thing I wanted to bring up to you both, I wrote down in my notes. I do think that the corpse in itself, the stench of the corpse, the smell of the corpse, the way that people react to the corpse, is a character in itself in the story, is a plot device for him.
Hmm.
Would you think? I don't know
Absolutely.
if any.
I'll
Yeah,
let I'll let Forrest take over as well for that,
Brian,
because
come in.
Brian, by all means, you come in next.
Yeah. It plays this one thing also. to answer about the stench being its own sort of character, that is Addie's state. And at the beginning of the novel, they kind of talk about it. How they're like, oh, when we're on our way, on our way
Yeah.
to Jefferson, it's gonna get like bad or whatever. And they say, don't
Yeah.
talk about that, like don't disrespect your mom. But then when you kind of put two and two together of the stuff happening, which is also something we gotta talk about, the elements. Faulkner, when it comes to water and fire, very deliberate, and he's always writing intense moments around episodes with water and fire. Again,
Yeah.
I will invoke Absalom. Absalom. I'll just leave that there. Um, um, but the stench, when you think about how bad she probably has to smell by the end of that journey,
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's like, the thing went underwater, and like her corpse was like half laid in water, and then it got roasted in a barn too. And the idea that, they're all kind of traveling, and that it brings someone's attention gets brought to it that almost starts a fight also. And towards the end again, where Jewel almost fights somebody for mentioning
Yeah.
like, oh, what the hell do they have? What the hell do they have in there? And um, and I think, obviously Jewel and Addie's relationship are the closest, which I think is why I think you're honed in on him as such an important character. You
Yeah.
know, um, not only is he not Ansa's son, who she comes to hate from a passionate relationship, but he's like a child of sin that she cares for, and he ends up becoming the character with the most will. But yeah, the stench of a coffin is always like in the background. It's a reminder that ultimately they're on this odyssey, they're on this journey, and we think they've become numb to it, while everybody else has to react to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, can I speak upon that
Yeah, of course, go
element?
Go
for it,
ahead.
Ryan.
So, just a preference. This is my first Faulkner ever. Just as preference. Just so you some background. So, um, stench. As they say, you get used to it. You could almost see the body as a metaphor or a symbol for, like, the family's like mental state, or like the
Mhm.
state of their relationships and stuff like that. And if they're like pushing it to the side, you know what I mean, and not like really like um acknowledging it, you know what I mean, it shows like the way I saw it is like they're also insular and worried about their own problems and stuff, that they don't even like acknowledge how bad it smells until they pass someone else, and they're like, what's going on, like, in there, you know what I mean, they're all quick to become like defensive and stuff, but like it's like so glaring obvious to
Yeah.
everyone else, you know what I mean, but they can't like see it themselves.
Yeah.
That's a way I read it.
That's almost a classical subversion as well. That is also a huge trope in Greek mythology, right? It's like the
Yeah.
feature that you can't see yourself. I wonder if that's some Faulkner irony, but I could see it being so, because that's something that he likes to do. I
I
I
mean,
will
I
say,
was
go ahead.
I was literally I was about to say that in response to Brian, because I think that Faulkner he does come across as a deep ironist also,
Yeah.
because I think even if he's knowingly doing a subversion of Odysseus, or a subversion of an Odyssey form of storytelling, I think the idea of a family dragging a matriarchal corpse is such a strong symbolic gesture that he kind of has to play around with it. I mean, it reaches a point where it's so borderline ludicrous of what the family's doing, that he
But he
can't not
promised
comment
her.
just by
But he
being present.
promised her. That's
Yeah.
his
Yeah, yeah,
answer.
exactly.
Yeah. It's almost comical after a while as well. But you know what? Brian said something that I wrote down here, and I think that there's also the dynamic of just a purely psychological dynamic of a dysfunctional family, when
Mhm.
something is so glaring to other people to see, but when you're inside that dysfunctional family, you won't be able to see what's going on. And I think the putrid smell of her body, Addie's body, but also Cash's rotting leg,
Yeah,
it
true.
all, and obviously, like, yeah, and the burning of the barn, it all kind of creates this inferno
And
that they are in.
and
Like,
the family have been traveling for like over a week as well
yeah,
through all of this. So like
They would smell as well themselves.
they'd be completely disheveled. And do you know a chapter that I really like? It's the Samson chapter, because it just emerges. It's the first person that they encounter, and it's like after a day, and then he like the stench is already starting to come through and whatnot. But because we get to see things from the first person perspective, we've seen it throughout everyone, and we've seen Varda, and like we've seen Dewey, we've seen Peabody, the doctor, and whatnot. And because like it's they've had one day for the trauma to set in, and for them to begin grieving, but then as it goes on, it's like the grief just kind of dissipates quite quickly, and it's like, okay, we literally have to get rid of this coffin now, and we just have to look at things in a more pragmatic way. Like Cash looks at the entire thing almost as like a builder, like a carpenter, like there's a job to do. And then we're seeing all of these borderline transcendent points of view from Dahl, and then out of nowhere we just encounter Samson, who's a guy where this family have basically just rocked up to his house, and he's not going through any of this grief, he's not going through any of these emotions, and he's just looking at the material thing of what's going on. Of this family, like whether it's through pride or what, they just have to stay out there. And I think structurally it adds a lot to the story, because it's very rare that you just get to see the narrative be removed from what's going on for a brief period, and it's actually able to enhance it, because you realize, hold on, what is fundamentally wrong with this family unit? Because seeing it from this objective lens, it even though we recognize their trauma and their grief, we actually begin to look at them as, are they also just crazy?
Just a massive genre.
Yeah, I thought it was nice when they would cut to an outside eye. It was kind of like the first time me reading it, it was kind of like putting into perspective like where they were at in their journey. You know what I mean? Just like looking at them and being like, oh, this is like, yeah, everything you read, this is like confirming things that you thought maybe, because it was a little bit confusing for me the first time, and it didn't really start to gel for me until they started crossing the river, and I really started getting like the benefit of the, what's it called, the different perspectives and stuff like that. Even at one point, I was like, did they lose the body in the river? I wasn't even sure.
Yeah.
You're not sure until they
Yeah.
plomp Cash down on top of it.
Yeah,
On top of it, they're so preoccupied with getting Cash's tools because he will lose his shit if he doesn't. They legitimately think he'll die if he doesn't have his tools,
yeah,
which is all part of his character. And it's like the feat, that whole sequence, the feat that they perform to cross the
Yeah.
overflowing little river is Herculean. It's impossible, right? And it's I've always kind of it deserves another reread from me yet again, just to see, because it's like when I think water and I'm thinking these subversions of the Odyssey, I'm thinking of the men through the passage between Scylla and Trebolus, you know what I mean? And so like, well, like I haven't seen that. And then you also, when you think water, which is something else we have to talk about, the Christianity in this book. Um,
Yes.
and not just the way people react to sin, but I think that the end of the book, I think one of the jokes about it is something about Christian culture, in a sense that like, oh, Ans makes good on his Christian promise, and now he's done. Now we can get through,
Yeah.
and he could move on
Yeah.
with life and get a new
Yeah.
wife. Everything's back to normal.
Yeah.
Well, this is part of it as well, because
I wrote down
like
loads about this. So
as I was reading through it, there was the line, the end of thingy Addy's chapter, like that finale of that got me so much. I had to stop and I had to punch the table, because it was just a visceral reaction that I got, and it
That's my
relates.
favorite chapter.
yeah,
Addy.
it is the best. I
Yeah.
think.
That whole idea of, I mean, because you do go through, I mean, very cliche, but you do go through a bit of a roller coaster of, when you're reading this book, what you're feeling. Okay, what is the book attempting to tell me here? Because I really thought, okay, it's a meditation on death, and it is that. And then you realize, but it's also about the futility of it. It's also about all of these people that is all meaningless. And then at the end, when we realize that, I do still feel like I do still feel that what this book ultimately is about the understanding of death and the journey that we all go through during it, even if it means that the journey is that, oh, we only realize it's important until it's too late. Because when you said, like, Ans delivers on his promise, and so okay, we can wipe our hands clean of that. It's at the end of Addie's chapter where she says when she was speaking about Cora, because we learned that Cora was praying for her, and then she says she prayed for me because she believed I was blind to sin, wanting me to kneel and pray too. Because people to whom sin is just a matter of words, to them salvation is just words too.
Oh
And
my
that
God. Oh
hit
my
me
God.
like a ton of bricks.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, and that's one of the big absurdities. That's one of the big contradictions within the characters. I think as
Yes.
Yeah.
uniquely as Southern Americans, as sort of, I guess you could say that it's Protestantism underneath the layers, and also, this idea of how to absolve of sin, and especially with Cora's character, and this idea of fate, of fatalism and predestination. Right,
Yeah.
it was always gonna happen, so it did, and now it's next, but continue.
No, no, it was just that. But
Oh.
by all means, Karen. But go on if you've got something to say.
Yeah, I do. Just if we're gonna talk about that chapter, I think there's a couple of things besides. I think obviously there's a big revelation that happens in those two chapters back to back, Addie's and the preacher right after, right? But there's a
Mhm.
line that a way in which she talks about Uns. Is it Uns? That's how you pronounce his name. I really struggle with the names
Yeah,
in this.
it's
That was the
ants,
worst for me.
ants.
Uns, yeah.
Yeah.
She says, I took Uns. And almost like implying this like very cold decision. And she then goes on to describe him like a bird. And I thought it was very interesting this idea of hunter and prey. At the same time, you have to remember, she asked to be buried with her blood relatives, right? Like way. And in this chapter, she talks so much about the idea of blood, of marking each other with blood, and they don't have blood relations, of course, because they just getting together to have a baby. So she talks about this idea, almost like we're sharing each other's blood in the concept of sin as well. And I had to write it down because I thought it was interesting. So there's sin, blood, and soil all in the same chapter. And obviously, like, when we go back to the boy, the 6-year-old boy,
Verdeman.
Verdeman, yeah. And the idea of the fish. Yeah, my mother is a fish.
Yeah, we hadn't even mentioned that. Yeah.
Yes, my mother is a fish. There's obviously
Greatest
like
chapter
the greatest
in
chapter.
American
Yeah.
literature.
There's obviously the naivety of a child, just coming to terms with death itself and figuring it out that the fish dies a certain way, therefore my mom is also dead. So there's this naivety of it. But we have to remember, like, the fish is also a symbol of Jesus. The fish is
Correct.
Jesus, like, and the fluidity of water and the corpse going. I don't know. There's so many elements in here that I think are worth mentioning.
I
Just
always
don't know.
say that in every Faulkner novel, literally every sentence is analyzable. They're masterpieces in that sense. They're true Gesamtwerks that, like,
Yeah.
everything is in its place for a reason. So you could talk about so many different things from so many different angles. And yeah, Vardaman discovering death has I've when I was first reading this book, that my preoccupation was a lot with Vardaman's character discovering both death and faith via the fish, kind of like what you're
Yeah.
getting at. Because after his mother dies, he's fishing in the bog where Tull, the neighbors, are like, "There's no fish in that fucking bog," like, what's he doing? Kind of like trying. I feel that as Vardaman's also trying to catch a live fish, trying to
Yeah.
reconcile that maybe his mom is alive somewhere else in the bog, in
Yeah.
the great bog, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
and
sorry
go
to
ahead.
say, I was just going to say, because I also actually resonated more with Vardaman than any of the other characters also, because I think there's this idea that, as you say, like, all of the lines within here, they are analyzable. And I think that there's a quote that I'm pretty certain that we've used, like, either in the podcast or on a video somewhere, because I know that we use it in, like, regular life, and it's about Faulkner. And he always said, there was an interview with him, and then someone was said, people struggle to understand your works even after reading them 2 or 3 times. It says, what would you say to them? And Faulkner's response was, read it a 4th time.
Read it
And
again, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's fundamental with Vardaman, because I think that ultimately, even though there is that deep depth in everything that he writes, I think everything is intentional. I think when you read Vardaman's chapters in particular, because it's a child, it also is this thing of, it looks, because it's interlaced with everything, that it possesses more than it is. But I also think there's a purity and
just
simplicity that
naivety,
is
yeah.
just,
He loves
it's
the
the,
buzzards. He loves
yeah,
the
exactly.
symbols of his mother's rotting, you know, he
Exactly.
Yeah.
tries to
And
catch them and understand them. Go ahead.
yeah, he doesn't have the eloquence of a Dahl to explain it. But the thing is, Dahl is a character I can't stand. Dahl, I hate him, and because I think he's someone that
Interesting.
as he's looking at the situation, he becomes the most involved in his explaining of what's going on. That, I mean, he ends up literally losing his mind because he's trying to tie everything together and the meaning of it. Whereas Vardaman, he just wants to understand why his mother is a fish and why his brother is his brother.
And yeah, you know, Darl is another character we could talk for eons. That Darl's mind breaks when trying to make sense of it all, when trying to do
Yeah, exactly.
justice. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
When trying to light those mules on fire because we don't deserve them because you ripped off my brother, right? Because my
Yeah.
stupid dad ripped off my brother of his prized possession, Snopes. Which, by the way, Snopes is a prominent. Faulkner's all his stories have like a universe. Yakpatenetpa County is where
Yes.
Jefferson is, where they all take. Snopes is a character in his trilogy, in which the first one is the best one and was made like 10 years before the others. The first book called The Hamlet, of a trilogy called the Snopes trilogy. And Snopes is basically like this early like like he's like a venture capitalist. He starts a fishing hamlet and becomes like this all-powerful person. So like the idea that Ans is haggling with him and selling him all of his children's prized freaking possessions, to accomplish his own goal. um that resonates also, with the idea when we're trying to look at this as a story of America. You know what I mean? Like it like
Yeah.
aunt's mortgaging all of his children's belongings to satisfy his own spirit, basically, to accomplish his
Yeah.
own goal. And I mean, a lot of people resonate with that today because there's that there's a lot of general I guess you could say, like, people accuse the boomers of having leveraged the future against them, you know,
Mm.
for their own livelihood. And it just makes me realize, the more things change, the more they stay the same. What can I say? But that scene where he is so devastating. Also, not to get too far out there, but when he's talking about what he haggled with Snopes, and then he says the horse, and they're like, "What do you mean the horse?" And like the whole book, we're like, Jewel loves this horse. He won't let anybody touch it. It's his. He snuck out at night to make the money to buy it. And it's this prized horse that freaking was able to get across the river on its own, and like
Yeah.
his dad just dealt it to somebody else.
And
When-
and and Doral even goes ahead and says that Jules' mother is a horse, which I have a whole bit about that, but
Correct.
Gordon asked to join in, so Gordon, do you wanna weigh in a bit?
Yeah, I didn't have a whole lot to say. Just sort of reiterating what you guys were saying. But first time I read Faulkner was in high school. I got partly through The Sound and the Fury, and I didn't finish reading it. I don't remember why, because I did like the book a lot. And yeah, I was really taken up by like his stream of consciousness writing. And yeah, as much as I was a little lost in the beginning of the book, through eventually I was fine. Like I knew what was happening and everything. But in terms of Faulkner's style of writing, like yeah, it's absolutely transcendent. Like
Yeah.
every like what you said, Forrest, like every sentence is not just analytical, but like every sentence is just beautiful. It's pure poetry. And I think what I'm impressed most of all with this book is not just the fact that every line he writes is beautiful, but he fuses that with sort of the way these characters talk, that sort of
Mm.
southern hillbilly talk. Um,
Yeah,
one
ear
part
et.
that yeah, one part that really stuck out to me was like where Darl's going like, oh, like she is was, but she was, but she's not is,
Yeah.
and blah blah, and,
I
and like I
I
was reading
love those
that.
lines.
Yeah, I was reading that over and over again, like trying to wrap my head around it because I'm like, this isn't nonsense. Like, this is
Yeah,
philosophy. This is the character who does not have the words to say what he means, and this is him trying to
Exactly.
express some kind of
Yeah, that is
philosophy.
a true stroke of genius. I think that's at least textually what made him famous. Is this a bit like Vardman absolutely sounds like the thoughts of a child. You know what I mean? Like or
Mhm.
someone not being able
Yeah.
to say what they mean and stuff. When I first read this book 10 years ago, just to like an aside, I guess it's 10 years ago now. When I first realized like what I was reading was special is when you get to the first Peabody chapter and Peabody's a doctor and it's
yeah,
just normal. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like you can read it perfectly fine. Why? Because he's an educated man, right? He can speak
yeah.
English. And that sort of juxtaposition was one of the first times I ever realized like, oh man, you can write stories like this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, to that point, I think I'm not sure if Louisa said it earlier, but you said Ants was like dumb. I feel like the whole family's in a way kind of they're all kind of like dumb, right? Like
I would say the children of ants seem to have these flaws where they are dumb, and it's like the willful one is not Ance's child. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like the
Jewel,
actual where Darrell is considered smart and
smart,
like
yeah.
precocious and attentive to detail, but he is a little too much, right? He's like out of his mind, and his self-awareness breaks him, like in those sentences.
But
Um,
I think that like Dahl
uh,
is only I think that Dahl is only intelligent in like the vacuum of the Bundren family because again when we see Peabody when we see Samson do you know like when they first go into town and then Jewel nearly starts to fight it reminds me of like Le'en how the film changes halfway through when
Mm.
all of these people that are so comfortable in their world go to somewhere else and they're so out of place and you must think if Dahl is this intelligent person could you imagine him functioning at all in any kind of normal society? Because it
He's
seems as
like
though as soon as he arrives in that world, you just those thoughts are not the thoughts of a person that would be able to function within the world, and ultimately he doesn't by the end.
he's like a big fish in
Yeah.
a small pond.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I
it,
feel like that's the real tragedy of the book is that these characters are not intelligent and that ends up biting them in the ass. And someone like Darl who may not be intelligent like in an educated sense, but the way he observes the world around him, he sees it in a very artistic way. And but because of the environment he was brought up in, he wasn't really able to nurture that. And so he's kind of stuck in this weird limbo between like civilization and just the Ozarks or whatever. And that's ultimately why they end up deeming him insane.
and it Louisa mentioned something that I was gonna talk about Jewel also that
Mhm.
had it not been for Jewel, they would have always failed. Jewel almost
Exactly.
single-handedly would like will the coffin across both the river
Yeah.
and out the barn, right? And so there's the extra strength in this relationship between Jewel and Addie, I think is always like underneath the surface and
Yeah.
that's what I find so interesting about his character also. I was gonna
Hmm.
say that it's not just let's say the family are not intelligent. I think the ultimate tragedy of the family and why Addie's chapter is so important is that it's a reluctant family. And this idea of motherhood, of this great thing, what God bestows upon like women to be their and Addie opens up her chapter saying, "Oh, I hate these kids." And you're thinking she's talking about her kids, but she used to be like a school teacher. And then when she's begotten children by Ansys, she starts to freaking hate it you know and
Yeah.
that there's a reluctance to this family they were never supposed to be here you know
Yeah.
and that was
Yeah.
that and that is something that's like so tragic when you get the context of it is that for all their flaws for who they are how they're discovering the world how they're dealing with self-awareness how they're dealing with the concept of death via their mother we understand that the circumstances around their birth are also quite complicated and there's another character dealing, and in the future will have a reluctant birth as well, because obviously the abortion was not performed on her.
Yeah.
Although she tries and she tries and she tries, but she's only there to be taken advantage of. I mean, even Leif took advantage of her as well, but she's not even married. right?
Yeah.
And like she's also trying to get rid of this child, and all it makes you think of is in the future, here's another reluctant child who's going to have to
Yeah.
bury their mother one day. You know what I mean?
I think,
Yeah,
I think
and some
where you got into with Jewel, this idea of Will, this character that, of course, like if it wasn't for him, he for me was the most important character as well, because if it wasn't for him, none of this would have happened in a sense. Like they wouldn't be able to get to the finish line. So he's always in a way in the tie between a hero and an outsider. And he is defined by his will. He is defined by his actions. He's the one that is barely speaks with his own mind, in a sense. He's we see him filtered by the eyes of the other characters, as I said before. But there's something interesting about his relationship to Ans as well, because Darl mentions, like, just going back to that, like, that Jules' mother is a horse. And in a way,
Right.
Ans strips him away from the horse. I do think that symbolically, it's him stripping away his independence, his possibility of going outside of the family. Because even when they are when they're going, Jules always goes ahead in his horse. Not only he's leading, but he's also distant and alienated from the family that can only
He's
observe
separate,
him
yeah.
and his actions, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Excellent
So
point.
I wonder,
yeah.
is it callous, or is it because he cannot process his feelings? He can only act, and we can only observe him from a family that is not blood related to him. And it goes again to that chapter where Adi talks about blood relations and this idea of rubbing each other in blood. I just think honestly, this book is so good.
I actually have something to add to that, actually.
Go on.
I think my perspective of Jewel is that he is, and the family treats him, that he is a utilitarian hero.
Exactly.
I think in the same
Mhm.
way, I think this is also a transgression as well, also of the Greek myth of the great return home, in the same way that John Ford did with Ethan in The Searchers. I think
The
the way that
Searchers reminds me of this book a lot as you continue.
Yes, yes.
Keep going.
I think the parallel between, say, Jewel and Ethan in The Searchers is this idea that the family will have him around ultimately, because although in The Searchers we don't want to admit it, because we do see Ethan as a hero, although he's rejected from society ultimately by the end. And I think a similar thing is occurring in here. They want Jewel around for their own selfish reasons, because we all know ultimately they're not doing this to take Addie to her resting place. You know, Doodle, she wants to go to get an abortion. They
He
all
wants to
have
terminate her pregnancy.
exactly, yeah,
Hans wants new teeth. Even
exactly, yeah,
Vardaman just wants to see the train.
yeah.
Yeah.
They all have
Any
their
bananas.
ulterior motives to do it, and Jewel is the one that's able to facilitate it, and he's the only one. That's the only reason that they would keep it around, and it comes to this idea of how do we integrate our material worlds with our idea of grief, with our idea of death, because I do believe that the characters, I do believe that, particularly at the beginning, that many of them in one way or another do grieve for Addie. Perhaps
Do you
not as
think?
much.
Yeah.
Perhaps not as much as Jewel, but I think that there is a degree, like when Cora is speaking of it, she's saying, "Oh, no one bakes like Addie Bundren." There is like a
Remembrance.
yeah, there's a sentimentality to what's going on, but I think all of this comes full circle as well in Addie's chapter, because there's a point where Addie describes motherhood, and she describes
Yes.
pride and whatnot, and she describes it as these things could only have been given names by people that didn't have it, because the people that do have it, they don't need to give it a name, they just experience it. And I think this is kind of like that parallel between what's going on between this dichotomy of the transcendent and the material of what goes on in this world, because it begins, I feel, as a much more transcendent novel, and then it becomes overwhelmed by this material aspect of it.
With this idea of the word, for example, that you're saying, don't you think it makes sense also that if people that have it don't have to describe it, then it makes even more sense that Jew, which only has one chapter speaking through his mind,
exactly.
he has it deeply,
Right.
he has that affection,
Yeah,
right?
His
exactly.
rashness is actually just his action is
Exactly.
is alluded to in those words.
Exactly.
Exactly,
And that's why, like, doesn't it make sense then the Dahl, who is a character we probably hear speak the most and is the most eloquent, and then quote understands everything, he's driven to madness by it, and ultimately that negates all the actions he do, because he's incapable of doing any actions after that. Whereas again, Vardaman, he is someone that he doesn't have the capacity to do action, but he doesn't need to explain it, and so we see him probably as a more moral, purer character, and Jewel as, I mean, arguably the most moral, but he is actually doing and facilitating the moral thing, and thus there is no description for it. There's no reason for it. And Addie, again, it's funny because we see Addie as a character, even though she's a corpse, because she is that thing that she needs to be. And I think, that poetry that comes when they're trying to describe what is and what is not, and things that is are, there is something fundamental in the act of living about trying to be that thing that you're supposed to be, and in the very act of even like,
right,
I mean, the irony with
the
Faulkner,
elusive
like,
exactly,
exactly,
you know?
and I think the irony that Faulkner's trying to get with, even in the act of us reading and trying to analyze the book, we're then furthering ourselves from the thing which we should be doing, which is ultimately living the thing which is indescribable.
There's a fertility to it, isn't it? I want to pose a question to you guys, because I do think that, just coming back to the corpse, there's this connection between the alive person, who she was, right, the Addie that we hear speaking that chapter, but also just this biological mass that is decaying in front of all of them. And there's a moment in the story that like the sounds of her decaying body inside the coffin, they think it feels like she's still speaking, and I really love that image so much. What do you guys feel when you hear that? Because for me, it's again this idea of the action, the materiality of life once more, like the fertility of all that is perhaps immaterial, perhaps the mass, the matter is still rotting, it's still talking, right? Even though it's not speaking anything. Do you know what I mean, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, something that we've been touching upon while talking. Also, that chapter, I have heard people, the Addie's chapter, describe as, imagine what if it's not a retrospective Addie? What if it is Addie's corpse, narrating as
Yeah, I
she's
heard that.
dying,
Like it's
you know?
beyond the grave or something.
Yeah.
And so like, yeah, that image of, I think it's Darla and Vardaman, like kind of laying next to, or is it Cash? They're like laying next to, her coffin, which is, she's put in reverse so her wedding dress can be sprawled out, which is, another touch of irony. Um yeah, but like, that they're, oh, you can hear her trying to turn to face away or whatever, or that she's speaking. Um and the I think one of the things that highlights in my mind is how the dead, sort of, it reminds me of James Joyce's short story, how the dead are so responsible for our actions while we're living. And like how they're listening to her speaking, they're ultimately on this journey to honor the wishes of someone who's dead, someone who won't care. And they're all talking is, was, what does it mean, why, how, someone who might, who bore secrets, but
Yeah.
they're ultimately doing these things to honor the wishes of a dead person, these things that are dangerous, almost kill them, may even have killed one. They have their selfish reasons and their reasons to honor their mother in that way. And again,
Says
so
that
this is this self-reflection, this self-awareness of, oh, my mom's dead, I got to do this for her, even though she probably wouldn't really care because she is not is, she is was,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and yeah, that's what I see with Darl and Varden and talking at the coffin, is this explanation of why they're doing what they're doing, um is because she even in death has this great influence on them as their mother, even as their reluctant mother.
or it's
Oh
like a
yeah.
way they could
Yeah.
take the burden off their actions. It's like, oh, it's not, we didn't want to do this. It's like, this is her request. So whatever happens, it's out of our hands type of thing.
There is also, I think
Yeah.
there's an element of that in, like, kind of what I said, like, there's a brief moment, it's like escaping me now, but I know I remember it, where there's like this mention of this fatalism where it's like, we're gonna have to do it and it's gonna happen because she asked for it,
Yeah, yeah.
um and yeah, this sort of like, maybe, yeah, they taken they're not responsible for it. It's what she wanted. That's why they're having to do all these things, while it's also convenient for them all to get to Jefferson.
Yeah.
You know? And
I
just
think
this complicated relationship of purpose between the living and the dead. You were saying?
no, well, I've just invited Jay in, so I want to know what Jay's gonna say.
Yeah, I think it's not just living in the dead. It's mostly for me, because I'm thinking about this a lot in the recent months. I think for me, mostly it was about parents and children, right? Like it's
Yeah,
not just living in the dead. It's like the previous generation taught these generations, and in bigger picture, the previous generations of American taught this generation of American,
absolutely.
and they go through
Absolutely.
this because they choose to, but also because they were taught to do this way, and they cannot, like, how can you not respect your parents, for example? That's what they told us, so we do it what our mother told us because she told us this, and so on and so on. But yeah.
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 Anytime you have a story, like my literature ears kind of perk up whenever you have a story that is revolving around children and especially their relationship to their parents, whether it's classical or modern, it has to do with that generational relationship. Kind of like how we were talking about how people feel about the way the boomers today as Ants and his children do about a certain American generation then. But yeah, that there's that relationship, that the generations, and how these people serve as archetypes for all sorts of Americans. The children are the future and the parents are sort of this past and present. What they do sets the road for the children's future, and the children responding to it is, how we get our present. That's
Yeah.
a dialectic, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Yeah. One thing
I
I
think
wanted to mention real. Oh, sorry. I
no.
wanted to, in terms of like Addie, like, I agree. She definitely felt like a presence still. It felt like she was still there. It also got me thinking about the ending, where Anne introduces his new wife as just Mrs. Bundren, and even when
Yeah.
she's walking behind him, the children sort of describe her, or Cash describes her as, she has like these wild eyes, and it almost gives a sense that she's like, there's like an insidious part of her, like a ghostly part of whoever this woman is, and it's sort of, not that she's like a reincarnation of Addie or anything like that, but I feel like there's something about, like the way he just threw away Addie for this new wife, and I feel like the ghost in their minds is always going to be there when
Well,
thinking of
When
this
I
do
woman.
you know what
first
I think?
finished this book, go ahead.
I was going to say, do you know what I think? I think what's crucial about this book in particular is that it ends at that point from Cash's perspective, because I mean, Faulkner had to pick, okay, from which voice do I end this book on? And I think that like the scene at the river, for instance, the river scene is ultimately one sequence which goes on for so many chapters because we're seeing every possible perspective from it. And it's the same thing over and over again. Like the description of the horse's legs coming up, like emerges in almost every single, because every person noticed that because for whatever reason it was relevant to them. But what I like to imagine is that imagine that if we could then see that same chapter playing out from Answer's perspective, like how he would describe it. The woman is only described as, her eyes are wild and whatnot because it's coming from Cash's perspective. Whereas I think that ultimately, again, this brings it back to that story of the majority of the story is still the relationship between children and their parents and this thing that they carry around with them forever. But I mean, Ans doesn't seem to realize the importance of this at all. He doesn't care what happens to his children in many regards. And as such, it's like that he's just imbued this generational curse to the fact that, like, even to the point of, I think that's why, the mother feels like a presence, because in some way that there's like this poison that he's fed within to the family that is like been imbued within Addie, that she is still with them, but almost as like this toxic smog that they can just smell that they'll never get rid of now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting. She's like carrying a gramophone, right? Like, which is essentially
Yeah,
Yeah,
a
which
record
is
yeah, she
what
carries
player.
Cash
a
Yeah.
wanted,
gramophone.
what Cash was saving his money for.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's a utility to the name as well, Mrs., right? And which
Yeah.
I think it ends up being quite sinister, like when you transform it like that. But I wrote I wrote down something about the teeth because I think it's a very interesting symbol of decay. And when he gets this new teeth, it's almost like a return to stature, but also
even
a
looks
fake
taller.
smile.
Well,
Exactly, a fake smile.
Do you know-
There's also a
do you know
connotation
what I
that
think?
is just colloquial, like
But-
just a fake smile.
Do you know what I think with that? I think again, this is like the irony of Faulkner.
Exactly,
that
yeah.
With the fake teeth, we've just been hauling around like a week-old corpse with us through the elements,
Exactly.
and now the fake teeth are important.
But I just imagined him smiling with this fake teeth, and he himself as a decaying person in a way,
Yeah.
like disheveled in a way, and just like I just imagine this like very white, like fake teeth. It's
Yeah,
almost like
so
it's symbol of hypocrisy. Yeah.
there's so much in that, just that last sentence. Like you said, the connotation of Mrs. Budgeon is that they bought a marriage license. The connotation that he has teeth is that he's got new teeth. When I first
Yeah.
finished this book, one of the things that I thought of was also like, and obviously I think it's from the chapter before, the $10 that she never gave to the other doctor that he talks to her about. Like, where do you get the money to get the teeth and the wife? You know what I mean? And the gramophone or whatever. And ultimately, it's I think he took the $10 that she had for her set aside from Leif for her abortion, and then he got teeth and a wife with them. Um,
Yeah.
and and also just the fact that, like, so she wants to not be a mother. She wants to destroy that future. She does not consent to it, and she's not even married, so it's not even Christian. Um, and so she goes to she's traveling on trying to get an abortion, and then this one guy says, "Oh, I'll do it." Gives her talcum powder, and for all intents and purposes, no abortion clearly happens. He just makes her drink turpentine and like
Yeah.
probably has his way with her. Because he calls her a hot mama and whatever.
Yeah,
And
and it says that it's going to be in the cellar, and then the chapter just ends.
yeah. And so like this idea that again, like we were talking about before, we're gonna have a reluctant mother who was never able to terminate this pregnancy, but also just the fact that the money that was supposed to end one life begins
Yeah.
their father's new life.
Yeah.
there, there is like this.
But
Go
it's
ahead.
the irony, isn't it? Because the classical sense of what an abortion is in literature and in symbolism is that it's a sin. It's something that destroys something, and the irony in this sense is that that's been used to buy and build something, but it's probably more destructive than even the abortion could have been.
Correct.
It's probably the worst thing that could have like. It's not just the
Mhm.
worst thing, it was the worst timing, it was the worst introduction. It's the ending of this book is so horrible and awful to experience because it just feels harder and worse than anything else that the family's been through.
It feels like we went through everything for Ans to just to get over it in this way.
For nothing.
One of the other things that I also think about the end in that irony is also like, oh, new beginnings, we have our recurrence, we get to start a new family. But I always think about the children and their relationship to their mother, why they were doing to do this, especially Jewel. One of the things we don't get that I want to see, we just get Cash talking about it a little bit, is wonder what happened after. You know what I mean? Like, what would be Jewel, Vardaman, and Dewey's response to just like, by the way, we got a new mom now. Yeah. you know, like and that's all being a mom is, right? But it's not. And
Yeah.
the end really, like, it highlights that, for a book. And Faulkner, I was going to say, because you've mentioned it a couple times, Faulkner is very, very cognizant of how the material affects people's lives. Another invocation, Absalom, just read it. But also like that end, the real horror is beyond the material, right? It's like it's emotional. It's the concept of motherhood. It's the concept of what it meant to bury her. It's the concept of how important it was to fulfill the promise, really. And we could talk about that all day. It's like, well, if the promise is fulfilled, yeah, how many obligations does he have, to keep doing this, or how happily married was he? And obviously,
Yeah.
she wasn't. And you know what I mean? Like, and everybody's lying to each other, and nobody is self-aware until she dies. So it all ties in on this big boom ending, and there's just more questions than answers.
Well,
Yeah,
I
that's
wonder about Faulkner's perspective with all this actually, because I don't know if Faulkner himself was much of a fatalist. Because I also question, we look at Addie as this kind of honorable person to a degree because we see this single perspective from her, and perhaps if we saw more, we might see her more as a selfish person. But we do get this idea that yeah, perhaps she was like a reluctant mother, but at the very least she was a mother, which you might not even be able to say like answers a father. He's just there by proxy almost. But I wonder if this idea of fulfilling obligations, if this is something that Faulkner in the novel is trying to get across, that humanity as a whole is unable to fulfill its obligations, and only in death, once things are too late, do we realize that
I think
oh
that's exactly what
yeah,
Faulkner intended to write with this story.
yeah.
If you could sum it up in one theme sentence, I think that's dead on what it is.
Because I feel like what there's a weird thing, and I think it's most noticeable in Vardaman's chapters also, is that when we hear the different voices emerge, there is also this idea that it doesn't always sound like that person's voice, because occasionally it's a case of, oh, the person is speaking of the past, and then momentarily they'll speak of the present, and then it's as though another narrator emerges. And like there's a bit, I've got a bit here from Vardaman, and it's like one of Vardaman's
yeah.
earlier chapters just before My Mother is a Fish, and it's he speaks as a child and whatnot, and he's just understanding the idea of what death is. And he says, I've got it here. He says, "I'm not crying now. I'm not anything. Dewey Dell comes to the hills and calls me. Vardaman, I'm not anything. I'm quiet. You, Vardaman, I can cry quiet now, feeling and hearing my tears. Then it won't. It hadn't happened then. It was laying there right on the ground, and now she's getting ready to cook it." And he's speaking of the fish there, and then he says, "It's dark. I can hear wood, silence. I know them, but not living sounds, not even him. It's as though the dark were resolving him out of his integrity into an unrelated scattering of components, snuffings and stampings, smells of cooling flesh and ammoniac hair, an illusion of a coordinated whole of splotched hide and strong bones within which, detached and secret and familiar, and is different from my is. I see him dissolve, legs, a rolling eye, a gaudy splotching like cold flames, and float upon the dark in fading solution, all one yet neither, all either yet none. I can see hearing coil towards him, caressing, shaping his hard shape. Beltlock, hip, shoulder, and head. Smell and sound. I'm not afraid." And this comes immediately after Vardaman just starts speaking like a child. So I put this towards everyone. What is this perspective that Faulkner's speaking? Because I don't think it's exclusive to the characters. I think there's some other transcendent voice that's speaking within
Through
the
the
characters.
yeah.
And I think it's
Yeah.
why, like, most people are like, I think most people feel like when Addie's speaking, it's like she's speaking at the present moment as a corpse.
Yeah, there's a lot of parts in the books that are written in italics, and I wasn't entirely sure what those were either. So yeah, I'm curious to see what you guys have to
It
say.
happens in all his books. It's kind of it's like it's also when I read it, I always think it's like it's a the whole book could be a stream of conscious, but this in particular is like what's running through their head. That's how I always
Yeah.
see it when it comes into the italics.
I
And
always felt,
good.
I was just going to say, I always felt it as though that was the voice of Faulkner.
Mm.
Jay just said, I think it's Faulkner writing at night, forgetting which perspective he's writing from at the moment. Well, that's the thing. Like,
Probably.
Faulkner's thing was that he was writing it, and he said when he wrote it that he didn't change a word of it.
Yeah,
Whether,
that's the famous story that
Yeah.
he wrote it
Yes.
over 3 weeks, didn't change anything about it, published it.
Maybe that was just PR to sound cooler.
It does sound cool.
Yeah.
Tyler, you're in, by the way. Hit the floor. Tyler, the suspense is killing me.
Tyler Durden, he's
Oh,
not
this
here.
Oh no, he's trying to figure out.
He was
Can you hear
saying that he would listen. Oh, there he is.
There we go. No, he's there.
Yeah, we can
Sorry, I
hear
had to figure out volume.
No, it's okay.
I was just gonna make the broad point, like towards the beginning. I wish I could have gotten in at the beginning just to get this out of the way, but Forrest really got the wheels turning for me. As far as I've been mulling it over for a while, of like what I really think about this book. But your discussion really kind of made me think about a lot of thematics and overall things about the book. That's really gotten me thinking a lot about what I think about it at the moment. But I was just gonna say, like, just in general, it's a very well timed um, read for me, just as somebody who's currently kind of experiencing the overall theme of the book right now. Like, obviously, um, like with my friend and his situation and all that, like, I'm hoping that he'll live a lot longer than he's currently been given, but eventually that time is going to come, whether it's a year or 5 years or whatever, whenever that time will be. But it's very well timed as far as like what I'm currently experiencing, kind of like my own kind of reflective meditation on death and the impending end of life and whatnot. But also that, and kind of my own like cultural experience reading the book, like I am I am deeply en route with like Southern culture, and I read my own experience and my parents' experience, my grandparents' experiences, as I could see that throughout reading the book, which I thought was really really interesting and really like insightful. Like Faulkner very much is like, even from an outsider's perspective, you could probably tell, but especially from someone that is from the deep south and is very in touch with southern roots and southern culture. It's very refreshing to see and to read a voice really that I can really resonate with, as far as somebody being from my culture, and especially from someone in the 20th century that really was able to effectively capture and to reflect his own experiences, and like capture the voice and the overall culture of the South during that time. But
Absolutely.
but also within that too, it's like it's very interesting kind of reading through, and to kind of hear a little bit of his criticisms and like his overall kind of nitpicks with culture, especially his critique on this kind of this grandiose idea, like we've kind of been hitting on this like throughout, is like the sense of fulfilling one's Christian duty, and like
Mhm.
the importance of the idea of fulfilling one's duty, rather than like, obviously that is important, and obviously that is a morally right thing to do, especially from like a Christian perspective. But it's almost kind of like this pharisaical idea of like doing it because we're told to do it, and not having the sincerity and the attitude and the right frame of heart and mind to do this. Like Ants is wanting to take Addie and bury her because she wanted him to do it, instead of like, I love my wife, even though he says that constantly. He's like, I'm doing it because she told me to. I'm doing this because I want
Doing it for
to
her.
honor her wish. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just reading what you were saying. How you bring up this good point. Duty is everywhere. And just to what you were saying is that also the woman's ultimate duty is to be a mother, a duty that Addie ultimately came to loathe.
Yeah, yeah, very much so.
And
Do you think they
and
were
that go
putting a
ahead.
lot? Oh, go ahead.
No, you.
I was gonna say, do you think they're putting like a lot of their weight was probably put onto Addie? You know what I mean? That's probably why she came to regret it.
In
So
death,
Yeah.
yeah,
that
so
is
like
how we
so at the end,
rationalize doing so many things. Go ahead.
yeah. So like at the
Yeah.
end, he was quick to pick up another wife to like I don't know if the word is to like hold the family together or to someone to lean on to do all the because in that in those days the 30s it's supposed to be contemporary when it was written, correct? Like
Yeah.
yeah, so like so they need a new homemaker. I'm trying to think of where else this comes.
It's kind of a good point.
Yeah, you know what I
Go
mean.
ahead.
They just need a lady to come in. Who cares who it is? Like, and who is this lady to like so quickly? I'm sure he doesn't know who she is. He just met her. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
She's
The
probably
kids won't get another mother, but I can get another wife. I need
yeah,
Yeah.
another wife. You only
I
get
think
one mother. I can get infinite wives.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think there's also the perspective where, sometimes like the problem is like the way that we look at the novel is similar as to how Dahl looks at life, in which we're trying to find the specific reasonings and
Right.
the patterns and how everything is a network. When the reality of the situation is we've been given so much information about ants that, the decision of where and why this comes from is that Ants is just not a very good person and doesn't care about anyone else. I
Yeah.
don't
You
think
could also
it,
say that he's
there's any great
grieving.
mystery to why he does it.
even from the beginning, Tull is like, yeah, Ans, like he couldn't help himself. What they say this, the book's actually kind of funny too. That's one thing.
Yeah, yeah.
There's not a lot of humor in a book like The Sound and the Fury or Absalom Absalom, but in this book, I actually, especially on this read, I found it a bit funnier. I think there was one, what first of all, like Tull and the others describing Ans as like a guy that like you don't want help from because if he did, he would just make everything worse. And, like and one of the funniest lines to me at the end, which I think is like a subtle joke, just more socioeconomic or political commentary kind of in the end, is when Darl's in the train to be like institutionalized, and he talks about how the seats face each other because they're
Yeah.
the seats of the state and that they're incestuous. Money of
Yeah,
the state isn't. Yeah. And I was like, that kind of makes sense in a weird way, in my
I like
mind.
how he's talking about like the
Yep.
nickels and like there's two heads on the nickels. That was
yeah.
enjoyable.
Yeah.
Oh, there was one other thing I was going to mention too, and I haven't heard her name brought up yet, but um, the one character that really resonated with me, even though she may not be the most important, um, really resonate with Cora Toll
Or
specifically from like a
Yeah.
cultural perspective,
Okay.
and her attitude towards piety, and like I
Mm.
think it's very interesting, like the chapter with Addie and kind of her conversation, like her perspective and Addie's perspective about their conversation with one another was
Yeah.
very, very interesting because I sincerely think that, and I've seen this throughout my life, um, as someone that has lived in the South and like has grown up in Protestant Christianity in the South and like kind of within that ecosystem or whatever, but um, kind of this idea to try to find the balance between authenticity and piety.
Mhm.
Um, and like there's certain parts where it's not like she's trying. I think she's genuinely trying to be, but there's just points where I kind of feel that there's like some sort of like disingenuousness about that and insincerity, but it's kind of to keep up appearances. Um, Not to say I don't think Faulkner intentionally wrote her character to be like
Mm.
kind of this false, kind of imbue her with this false piety and like come at it from a perspective of like all people that present themselves as pious are hypocritical and they're false
I
within
don't
their
think
own
he makes
piety
her
and
seem
whatnot.
hypocritical. He makes her. I think she comes off more as naive to us modern audiences,
Yeah.
or at
Yeah,
least to
yeah,
somebody
I
like
would agree
Addie.
with
She
that.
comes off as somebody who like, oh yeah, you say that, but like, do whatever. But yeah,
I
I
think
can
Cora is
see.
a,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna because I think that Cora is a well-intentioned character.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I think too. She's like one of the unambiguously good people, just like
Yeah.
looking out for everybody. Um, and also the way that Korra is written, I can see how you identify, especially from that culture, because the way she's written comes off to me is exactly that, like the sort of rural, genteel Southern woman who has, faith, a good old girl, like grandma, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I
Um,
Contrarian
read my
woman.
grandma when reading her character.
Yeah.
exactly. I was thinking that too. I'm from the north of the South. I'm from South Florida, so I'm not really from the South, but
It's interesting because like being an outsider from the United States, it's because the world is so imbued with American culture. We've experienced it vicariously, and so we understand the tropes of like Southern American culture and whatnot, but at the same time, the rest of the world still sees it as like, oh, it's American culture. And yeah, I get like, obviously, there's a vast difference between, someone that comes from the Northeast compared to someone that comes from Mississippi. But there's still this idea that, oh, it's still the US, it's all ultimately the same culture. That's a perspective that most people have. I mean, I've always described the United States as essentially being like 5 different countries rolled into one, because I think that it's just too radically different at certain parts. Like culturally, I
Yeah,
think there's such strong
Absolutely.
distinctions. Like I'm always reminded, when like even in something like this, reading a story like this, and hearing Tyler, you for instance, saying that it is very endemic and specific to your culture. I find the perspective interesting.
yeah, it's true. I mean, the initial conception of the United States was each state was supposed to be act as its own country, essentially.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It wasn't until like
its
after
own
World War
state, one
II.
might say.
You could say that. That's an interesting way to put it. But what's it called? But I wanted to touch upon. I haven't heard anyone bring this up. Towards the end, when they're walking down the road and a car like passes by them, I found, yeah, it was jarring. I was like, for whatever reason, I wasn't thinking there was like automobiles or
Yeah,
anything.
yeah.
You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
I
when
had
they
the
first
exact
get
same
to the
reaction
city.
too.
Yeah.
Was that? And I was thinking, like, is it supposed to be like funny? Like, oh, if they would have taken a car, if they were more well off, none of that would have happened. You know
I
what I
think
mean?
that is the
Yeah.
joke of the line a
Yeah.
Yeah.
little bit. There's
Yeah,
there's
that's what I
also
remember.
of the many dichotomies of the many dichotomies in the book, there is also a strong rural urban
Yeah.
difference, conflict.
Uh-huh.
There's even this idea of like the road itself, the road that takes you where it's supposed to go or whatever, because their house is like so far from it, or and like the who is it that narrates that? I think it's Vardaman. It's somebody
In the car.
I, no, it's at
And
the
then
beginning
like
of the
God
book where
putting
they
the
talk
road.
about
So I think it's Cora. Isn't it Cora? She talks about the idea of
it
God
might be
placing the
Cora.
road. I'm not.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
sure.
Placing it too close or too far to do a certain
Yeah.
thing. And yeah, that section was also like interesting to me that because she talk I think it is core because she talks about there's a teleology to everything when both Cash as a character was building the coffin and then Cora also that she talks about the roads as being something kind of laid down by God like the right way that they're supposed to be. Oh, they're done long ways because they take
Yeah.
you somewhere else, whereas things that are up ways that are
Yeah.
meant to stay still or
In one
whatever.
place, yeah.
Um, and but yeah, the rural urban differences are big, and you kind of see Mississippi and the people's what would I say? Their proclivities, their sentimentalities change as they get closer to Jefferson. Like Amistad and Sampson as people, and then ultimately they get to Jefferson, which is like the city, and like you said, like oh, there's a car, and people actually mention the stench that pisses
Mm-hmm.
off Jewel. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think even as a literary device, I think that point where like Brian said, it does catch you off guard because even as you're reading it, it's like, And then there were cars. You're like, oh shit! Wait, there's cars in this world.
Yeah.
Like they feel the entire thing like they're so separated from time that when I'm imagining them on the journey as well, I don't even imagine them on the road. Like I just imagine them pulling this wagon through like the worst field that you can imagine. It's like they made it intentionally harder for themselves
Yeah.
on this journey.
I
But
was
they did,
imagining like settlers.
like many
and stuff.
times they choose to make it more complicated for themselves. Like the dad of
Yeah.
the family, the ass of the
Yeah.
family says that, oh, I don't want to own any, I don't want to be in on, fuck, I don't, nobody can own me, whatever. I would say from this perspective. So they choose to beg and choose to make people give them stuff instead of like buying or owning or renting or anything. They choose to do a lot of things because of their values of like pride or stubbornness, which are
And instead
kind
of
of
waiting for the
artificial.
river to recede, they decide to like cross it anyways,
Yes.
and it causes all the problems.
Or just
Yeah.
go around wasting time as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something,
And I think that's another interesting thing. When we just started talking about this with like grandmas and stuff, and then the Korra character, I think the interesting stuff is the values here. That there's some they have those values that were passed around from previous generations and other people, but they're quite artificial. Like they don't take the values and the skills, they just take the artificial things, like with pride, for example, right? The father is like, I can do everything myself. I'm the man, right? I can do it. I don't need anybody else to help me. The same with the Cash, that he can build the coffin. We can do it all ourselves. We have the skills. We don't need anybody's help. So we're the Americans. We're the man, right? But then the thing is, somehow they don't have the skills and they don't have the more deeper values out of this. So they just have this kind of surface, and that's why the whole decay of everything, right? Like instead of learning maybe how to cooperate, maybe how to do stuff better, they're just like, oh, we have those values. We're gonna be stubborn about them, but we're not gonna go like deeper and try to improve on them, like try to be better carpenters or
Yeah.
better parents. They just like stay on their stuff, like, oh, I've been taught to be stubborn. I'll be stubborn, but I'm not gonna actually do this better or anything like this.
They just
I like that.
It'll
don't
very mechanical and cyclical.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and to drill the point, as I say, I think it's way better explained in Epsilon, like this value and decay of values.
Yeah.
Well, we'll pick that for next year then, so everyone can stop complaining about it.
Hey,
I'm interested.
Forrest, would
Mhm.
you recommend this book first for someone that never read Faulkner, or what would you have recommended first?
The one I always recommend first is his short stories. The three of them are A Rose for Emily. The second one is The Bear, and the third one is The Evening Sun. And I would say
Okay.
like, oh yeah, oh if you like those, then you should keep going. I actually, like I said, I think this one is harder. I always try. I recommend Epsilon first, just
But I
because.
wouldn't agree.
Good.
Like I think you mentioned that it's easier, but I think it's easier in some sense, but more complicated in different ones. Because all of them, like the main books, are complicated in different ways.
Yeah,
I
no, I
think,
agree.
and I think for
I
some
think
people, sorry,
before you were
yeah, you're
here, I
right.
would mention that I think the most accessible one he has in terms of his English is Light in August. Whereas, like, yeah, I get what you're saying. In Absalom, the vocabulary is really elevated. Like, you got to read that book
Yes,
with a thesaurus. Legitimately, he uses
yeah,
all sorts of like $1 million words.
yeah.
And this
But you
book,
also
you
don't
don't get
have
that at
to.
all.
Like if you
Yeah, you
know
also
that you
don't
don't.
have to.
Yeah,
There's
if you
enough
know like
context.
the meta out of it, like if somebody comes and tells you like, oh, Faulkner is hard, but you don't have to understand each sentence, because especially in Absalom is the same story set told 5 times, and you just read the first chapter, and then the first chapter is repeated 5 times from different perspective and different zooms. So if you didn't understand one sentence 3 chapters ago, you
Yeah.
have 4 chances to understand it. But if somebody tells you
Well,
like, no, you have to struggle, you die on the first chapter and you don't read the rest of it, and you just like, fuck
so
Faulkner,
now I
what is
think
this shit?
you
And that's
guys
it.
are discovering a common trend in Faulkner's novels. That's
That's
Is
what he
this
meant
one?
when he was saying read it again. He was just talking about reading one of his books.
But
Yeah,
they're quite similar. And also in Epsilon, I'm not sure if he does it in other books, but it's just recently I read them back to back. He talks about to be is was or is will and all this shit in every book. So it's
yes,
it's almost the same all
the
the time. This
the
to be
self-awareness.
variations is very common.
The self-awareness is always. It also happens in the Sound and the Fury, and
Okay.
that which is itself like, which is
So he's like
itself.
Ozu. He's like Ozu of literature. The same movie 10 times, and he's like the same book 10 times. I see.
I agree with that.
and but that whole like to what I am is was that self-awareness. There's like the tragic self-awareness. It's like the characters who have it are tragic. The characters who don't have it are like either good or evil, and they all fight. And then that's there. There you go. That's the story of America. Um,
Pretty
and
good.
but yeah, would you recommend As I Lay Dying as a first read to someone getting into Faulkner?
I think it's way more accessible than other novels. But I agree with you that short stories are way better starting point. I think for a lot of authors, I think it's a good
Yeah.
take. If you don't like their voice in the short stories, why would you waste your time, quote
Yeah.
unquote, for the longer
So
things?
he actually considered the short story. Well, he considered poetry the like the paramount of the English arts.
Yeah.
And the reason he became an author is because he thought he wasn't a good enough poet. And next to poetry, he thought the short story was the next most superior form of the English arts, in which he thought, yeah, I'm okay at these. And then, he as a novelist was like, I'm not as good as what I think is the best or the second best, but I'm pretty good at this, what I consider,
Yeah.
beneath those two.
I kind of agree, especially with like what Moore wrote about David Foster Wallace. I think there is a gap. You either write short stories, it's either you can concisely say something in a really short thing, or you need a really big thing like the Infinite Jest or the War and Peace. It's either something that you have a lot of characters and you need to develop it over a long time so you can express your idea better from different stuff, for different perspectives and different times and different situations. Or
Yeah.
you have to be concise and say it in a short. Like in the middle, it's like you kind of saying it and kind of not. So with like Epsilon, and Lay Dying, it's the same themes, and he kind of explores them from slightly different direction, different things. But he tries to say the same thing, and he cannot put it in the one way. So he tries it again. It's like, oh, maybe this time is going to be better.
Yeah.
But
It
if you
reminds
wrote a
me.
big ass book, maybe you could put all of it in one.
Yeah. The whole myth of Yakutinapa County. He
Yeah.
and he
Like a
if
whole.
Oh yeah.
if you guys didn't know, he also had a foray into screenwriting. He's a co-writer on The Big Sleep with Humphrey Bogart. Um
Is it?
yeah, he is. He's one of the writers on The Big Sleep. He thought Hollywood in the 20s and 30s was fucking Babylon and he hated it. Don't blame him. He's probably accurate there. But yeah, he's a co-writer on The Big Sleep. I
See,
think I'll go ahead.
I've got a thing about like Howard Hawks is because I think that Howard Hawks has made some of the greatest films of all time, but I find his work so hit and miss, and I think The Big Sleep is actually one of his weakest works.
I'm not a huge Big Sleep fan just because there's so many noirs that I think I like more from
Oh
like
yeah,
actual noir age. But it's iconic. I mean, I'll watch it. I like it. But yeah, Howard Hawks, we're like Red River and Rio Bravo, his later career is just like to
yeah,
me it's his
definitely
ultimate.
amazing. But I mean, I don't know,
Yeah.
like I get for some reason like The Big Sleep is iconic, but like when you put that next to like a Double Indemnity, I'm just like, nah, it's not even close.
How about Laura, the goat?
What was that one?
Preminger.
What's the one that he does? There's a film of the Howard Hawks. I just don't like it. Is Only Angels Have Wings.
Oh, no,
Has anyone
that's
seen Only Angels Have
terrible.
Wings?
I've seen it a long time ago.
No.
Rita Hayworth, that one.
It's
Yeah.
Rita Hayworth.
Guys, I don't
Isn't
like
that,
that.
isn't that Humphrey Bogart?
No,
Oh,
it's
I've
not.
seen
It's
it
like
last year. I like it.
That's like
it's
OG,
Cary
OG,
Grant, isn't
OG
it?
Howard Hawks.
Yeah, it's from 39, I think it is. But it's like fucking. I just couldn't get into it at all. It's about I don't know what the fuck it's about. It's about
both don't
an
like it.
airstrip in the jungle, and then one of them's gonna fly, but it's too cloudy, and it's basically Casablanca, but in the jungle and shit.
Yeah. So one of the, when I guess when I first saw Only Angels Have Wings, I thought it was like the greatest thing I had ever seen. That was before I had saw something like Casablanca or like the Lubitsch films,
Yeah.
or even other Curtiz films of like invisible directing. It's like lower down on like my golden age invisible, but it is just like people talking in the jungle. Um, I still like it, hater, but but I guess it is lower on my rungs. Like Casablanca's Casablanca. You know what I mean? Casablanca is awesome.
But
Yeah,
listen, Esteban. Oh no, we're gonna have to type this to Esteban. But if we're just gonna shoot the shit with each other, we can call the book club here if we want, and we can all just jump
Can
into
I
the
say one
hangout.
more thing?
Yeah,
I
of
did have
course.
a couple.
Oh,
I did have a
Okay.
couple
keep
things to
going.
say.
All right, never mind. Then go on.
Okay.
I
No,
just
let's
like
keep
Movie
going.
nerds taking over.
So
just
it's
like
about
Segue over.
about the Daryl character. After hearing everyone talk and him losing his mind for trying to understand what was going on. Is that like is that a joke too? Because like for maybe like the reader like trying to figure out the
I think
story
it's
the first
ironic.
time and they lose their mind
There's an
or
irony to it that I
Yeah,
think that
definitely.
what I was kind of touching on is that like Darl is trying to make sense of
yeah,
actions that people do that don't make
Yeah,
sense, that are
Yeah.
yeah.
contradictory. You know,
exactly.
like the tragic futility of all the characters. And this was something Luisa said earlier that I wanted to talk about the
copyright.
nature in in the novel too. That when Darl lights the barn on fire,
Yeah.
um, and you describe it as an inferno, and
Yeah.
that Faulkner and fire is so evocative that something always happens where it's like it's someone's descent. No spoilers for the book that shall not be named anymore because we've said it already, but that's there's that one. But the barn, but he
Get
also
over
has
it.
the short story Barn Burning, in which the Barn Burning is what Burning by Li Cheng Dong is based on. Um uh and that story is sort of about how these two classes of individuals that can never see reality the same way, one of them uh, just finds it in themselves to destroy the other, to destroy the abode of the other. And uh, now that you've read some Faulkner, you should go and watch Lee Chang Dong's Burning, by the way, just so you can see, you get the perspective
Oh,
and
that's
the incidents and the
the Korean,
nature.
the South Korean film,
Yeah, the
right?
Korean movie.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
seen that.
with
Yeah,
Steven
yeah, yeah.
Yeun. The
Yeah,
great
I
movie.
seen that. Yeah.
I,
Um,
I I
Yeah.
think that like the best way that I can sum up Dahl as well, like the real life counterpart, if we just want to use like actual characteristics of real people, it just reminds me of Nietzsche. This idea that, there is this idea that is this fatalistic thinking of Nietzsche, that there's the archetype that is what drove him insane, and yet even in his insanity, he's willing to philosophize on it of like the Mutter ich bin dumm, as though like he has to still understand his own descent into sanity. That's how I view Dahl as a character akin to that.
Okay.
Yeah. Something
yeah.
something else I like about the ending, coming back to that, I guess if you're done with that. But something else I like about the ending is yeah, how you were saying earlier how it's like how Faulkner is like subverting stories, and especially how this film is inspired by the Odyssey. We never actually see we never actually see Eddie be buried or like
Yeah,
have a funeral. We don't really have a satisfying scene of her returning home.
we don't.
And
Excellent point.
yeah, and it kind of so it not only is it like anticlimactic, and it implies that they never really bury her, but it also just it makes the story so much more miserable. Like they're just stuck in this constant state of grief. Like they never really bury their grievances, and that is what I liked. I remember earlier, Lewis, you were saying how like the story you thought it was going to be like a meditation on death, but like by the end of the story, it's not even about death or grief. It's just all these characters just kind of forget about it. And
Yeah,
it
exactly.
just becomes a very miserable story where, like, one of them loses a foot, the other one gets taken to an asylum, and it's a very sad story. And again, I feel it's so much a result of like their lack of intelligence, but also just the culture they're raised in. Because coming back to the chapter of Addie as well, where she's describing just sort of her gripes with motherhood, this weird fusion she has of love and spite and just the complex emotions that has of being a mother. But that's the way families were back then. We can look at that in contemporary and be like, oh, how horrible is this? But she describes early in that chapter that about like being hit with a switch by her father and the blood and the flesh, and basically like that's the closest that family got back in this time. And it is sad that like these characters are grieving, but they don't have a healthy way to express that or anything. So
I don't think
this
family
is
is much better these days. Because those family taught the other generations, the next generation taught the other generations. It's way more behind closed doors, the physical violence, but also there is different kinds of violences. It doesn't have to be physical, and the abuse has come in still because they were taught this way, and then it kept bringing back to the point. Because I was just overthinking about this all the time, so I cannot bring it back to this. It's just they were taught like this, and then their children learned, and they're like, how do I raise my child? I have to beat it probably, or have to abuse it, because that's how I learned. And that keeps going and going until it stops.
Yeah, this is
That
also
question of go ahead.
I
Holy
was gonna
shit!
say this
Everybody
is
wanted to
also
comment.
smacked down like at the beginning of the Great Depression or like during the Great Depression. So a lot of people's minds were just on survival and stuff like that. I feel like a lot of that is taken into account. You know what I mean? Maybe the selfishness and like how everyone is. You got this duty, you got this job to do, and we just got to execute it. No ifs, ands, or buts type of thing. So I don't know. A lot of that could be taken into account. I was gonna say it's kind of in a very loose way. It's like a reverse Heart of Darkness, where they start in more archaic place and they go to a more civilized society. You know what I mean? It's very loose, but I was thinking about that during the discussion.
Which he was a massive fan of Joseph Conrad. Was one of his favorite writers. He said that I think that same University of Virginia speech that you were talking about earlier, where he talks, which is an excellent Q&A that he had. They asked him like what his favorite books are, and he talks about Conrad. He talks Anna Karenina. He says Don Quixote, and yeah, those were his bigums. So he like yeah, the Conrad sort of it's funny that you mentioned that like that this is also sort of a journey, and he obviously would have would have read this, especially when he was younger. I wonder if it's stuck in his mind. It reminds me of like how Cormac McCarthy, since we all read Blood Meridian, like when Cormac McCarthy started his career, he purposely needed to like distance himself from Faulkner because he was like, this is like my favorite stuff, and I can't like let it get caught up too much in my voice because then I'm just gonna be a repeat. Same with Wallace talking about Gravity's Rainbow that he considered like a Bible when he was an undergrad or whatever.
But I
That's
don't think
interesting.
I can see that, to be honest.
yeah, I don't think that like I think that just by knowing that you can clearly identify that voice, I think that if any kind of artist or any kind of creative is on the constant need to remove someone else's voice from them, I think it's an inevitability that they're gonna use a bit of their voice, and you can see that in McCarthy right away.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like
Just
it's
deep.
something you can't avoid, but you have to be cognizant of. It reminds me of Tarkovsky talking about like, oh, if I see a shot that, Mizoguchi or Bergman did, I gotta redo I gotta reshoot the scene because then it's not my personal art,
Well,
my
it's
may
my
as
hard.
well,
utterance.
Yeah. Well, it's hard
yeah,
to
you may as well be
distance
honest about
yourself.
it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, it'd be hard
I
to
was
Yeah.
gonna
distance
say,
yourself because if you like fall in love with like literature or film or whatever medium because of that person, you know what I mean? You're inevitably in your subconscious
yeah,
gonna lean towards that. You know what I mean? There's like
Yeah.
no getting away from it.
you may as
Yeah.
well just take it and steal it, like, because you're gonna do it anyway.
It's the Picasso quote, isn't it? Great arts to
Yeah,
steal.
great artist, good artist copy and great artist steal.
Yeah.
He has I like Faulkner. He has a couple lines in this book about space and time as well, that all his books have this sort of the relationship to the past. We have it with the dead mother in this book and her sort of like reluctant history and the future. That he has this great quote which is featured in Midnight in Paris by Woody Allen. But it's just a good quote in general where he says, I love it. He says, there is no such there is the past is not gone. It
Yeah.
ain't even past.
Mm.
Where he says, you know, basically this concept of the arrow of time is an illusion and there is no past. We're all in one big canon of history, whether we like it or not. So I don't know if he was himself a fatalist or not, but everything is kind of like pointing me towards the idea that he does believe in tragic destiny, in tragic fatalism, because all of his books have that theme and suggesting that, you know, there's the past isn't gone, it's not even past, also suggests that you know,
Mm.
there is no such thing as the past. There is
I think
just such thing, you know.
Yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
think it would be hard to read this book and not come to that conclusion, especially with the ending of this idea that he's going to craft this network of, I mean, even the familial connection. We're immediately going to look at how they relate to one another, at the people that individuals within the family are specifically drawn to. And, you know, as you read it, you realize that what we expect from the traditional formalist approach is that we're going to have a network of people, and the greater the artistry is, then the better those connections will be, the more of them there will be, and we will be able to craft this thing where every person is connected to someone else. And I think that one of the things that people struggle with Faulkner's writing is because his subversion of that was a case of, no, what we can do is just have these intentional gaps, because that is also the way that life is. You know, you have a family of say 12 people, not all 12 of them interact with one another all the time. There might be two that connect over here, and then the rest of them are kind of fluid and whatnot. And I think that his fatalist perspective comes of this idea that, yeah, similar to how you say the past hasn't even passed yet, these answers that we're constantly looking for, we'll never find them. And not only that, when we reach the end of the story, there's a possibility that you do find something and it was, oh yeah, none of it mattered, by the way, which is how this story kind of turns out.
Precisely. And it's like it's again this very modernist idea, but the play with the reader, where also I think Luisa was kind of alluding to this in his narration, in that there is this epistemic uh resonance between the characters and us as the readers, that their, you know, ironic futility is kind of is there's a joke about our ironic futility in trying to get the whole thing, like us as Darl, as
Mm.
I forgot who was just saying it, you know, making sense of the story, you know, ends in infernos for justice, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing
I
about
think
like
it's
the
interesting.
Christian aspect of it
Oh
too is like again we mentioned earlier how everything to these characters is just sort of mechanical. It's like a chore. And even like the
yeah.
Christianity is not out of like a pure love or devotion. It's just again, it's just another duty. It's just another thing we have to check off the list of things to do.
Correct. Duty is super important. What were you also going to say, Louisa?
Um, oh, yes, okay. I was gonna talk about this idea of dissolution because I think just like the body is decaying and rotting, we see the dissolution of the characters' perspectives. I think throughout the book, they do become clearer in their own voices. But then after when I was looking at how Faulkner wrote the book, I imagine also that it's not only the characters becoming clearer in their own emotion, but also he himself, Faulkner, getting a clearer vision of how he wanted the characters to speak. So I think it ends up working really well as Brian said, this idea of like a reverse Heart of Darkness. But at the same time, I think it's my theory is that it was also Faulkner himself coming to terms with the voice of the characters and
Yeah.
becoming just more articulate
More
within,
lucid.
yeah, more lucid within them. Yeah, so I think that was an interesting play because in a way, it worked very well for the structure of the novel. I think for all the subversions that he does, this book still has a level of formalism. He's never able to divorce himself totally from formalism, right? Because he is a great
Yeah,
writer.
he has such a master of the classics and of the culture that his subversions are super like profound. Just even
Yeah.
like what
They
Gordon was
also
saying,
feel
just shows
effortless.
the beauty. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say they also feel effortless. Don't feel like he's
Yeah.
trying.
It feels like it's folklore, you know. It came
Yeah.
upon us this
Yeah.
way.
But there's a level of funny enough, this idea of folklore. I do think that especially in like in the country culture, there's a level of like people telling stories to each other, and a lot of what is passed on from your familial experience is the oral tradition, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Mom's
It's like
story.
supposedly
folklore.
Can we just know in the chat like the greatest pun ever just occurred
Hold
by
on.
Edward?
Let me see.
Gordon also heard it, but he was too slow.
Yeah.
Folklore.
David
Folklore.
I think that might be everything, unless anyone else has any.
You just want to finish the
No, I don't. No, I don't. No, I don't. This
Folklore is
show
the perfect place to end this.
I'm also enjoying.
I got one more question. It's kind of related to book. Has anyone watched the James Franco directed movie? Is that good?
I was gonna mention this.
I was wondering if we were gonna bring that up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember watching this trailer when it came out because I think during this period, like James Franco made a
Oh,
point of like,
stop.
okay, I'm gonna be
Stop.
like the indie darling director,
Oh,
and then
God,
he
he's
made like
horrible.
8 films on what looks like a budget of like $10.
Yeah.
He made Child of God. He got to make
Yeah,
this. He got to make The
yeah.
Sound and the Fury. He got some. He got some beautiful rights, and he squandered them, bro. If please, like, just horrific.
I saw the trailer
James
to the
Franco has written a screenplay for Blood Meridian, but he hasn't publicized it yet.
You know what the worst part is? You know what the absolute worst part is? It's that before this movie came out, this was like right around the time that I was getting into Faulkner. So this was like 2013, 2014. This is my sophomore, junior, senior year of high school. It seemed like when I was like, because I was reading the publicity, I really wanted to watch him. It seemed like Franco kind of knew what he was talking about. In his interviews, you know, he says these statements about like, oh, you know, the you see, he brings up things about like, oh, the ironic futility and these character. It's all ultimately about character, and their visceral emotions are hidden behind the sentences, and I'm like, wow, he's read it. He's read it well, so the film will be good. Yes, and oh man, what a disaster.
Yeah. I saw the trailer and the tone seemed off to me. Like I don't know what it was going
Because it
for, but
is.
yeah.
At least as I lay dying is something where the voice, the voice says are like 95% of the art there. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I wouldn't dare adapt this. And it's funny because the novels that I like more, which I guess the Sound and the Fury barred the Sound and the Fury, but the ones like Absalom and Light in August, I think those are actually really adaptable, even though some might say they're more complicated. And like, you know, it's just that the Faulkner estate will never pony up those rights ever again after that
If anyone
disaster.
wants a funny story,
Oh, God.
so at the time when Louisa and I met, Louisa was staying with some friends in New York,
Oh, God.
and these friends were like proper like upscale New York types that wanted to be cool New Yorkers, but you know that kind of Strokes-esque New York.
They were.
So they were staying in a place. It was an apartment. It was on the Upper East Side, wasn't it?
No, it was Bushwick, but it was
Uh,
owned by the guys of MGMT.
Yeah, so
They were-
MGMT
oh, God.
used to live in this place,
Nice.
and a friend stayed there. and we just met at this point. She was like, "Oh yeah, my friends invited me to New York to
So I
go."
stay there.
So I was like messaging her at the time and being like, "Oh yeah, how is everything?" And then she was like, "So yeah, my friends know James Franco, and apparently like they're just in a cafe with him, and like he's gonna come and see us and whatnot." So then I get the news of like, "Oh, how was everything?" And basically what happened was James Franco goes to places and like brings poetry books with him and whatnot. And so they were in this cafe, and Louisa was there with James Franco, and James Franco was hitting on her whilst all by trying to get into her with poetry in some place in Bushwick.
What a Francoism! That is Francoism right there. And I'm not talking the phalangists of Catholic Spain. I mean Jimmy Franco. Oh boy,
He was trying to give you acting lessons.
what'd you say?
Say he was trying to give her acting lessons.
Oh god, it was not a flex, but we were talking all the time, Lewis and I, on text. So that is not a flex at all. It was a very embarrassing experience, actually.
Oh man,
I've seen him in real life. One time we went to go watch. Well, we're in the same theater when we watched Parasite in Hollywood. I saw him outside, and my friend said, "What's up?" to him. That was about it. But I've seen him.
did
once.
you ask him how it was, and did he look at you and he go, "Oh,
No,
delicious"?
It was right before we went. It was right before we
So
went
nice.
in, and that was around the time where, he was getting like exposed or outed or canceled. Or whatever. So he looked really sad and depressed. And my friend was like, "Hey, James, what's up?" He was just like, "Hey," he was didn't sound happy.
Because I
But
said no to him.
If you do want to read good, like I guess you could say supplemental material for this, besides Cormac McCarthy, there is an author who I think it's like I said, this book doesn't have black and whiteism as much as his others, but Toni Morrison is like who also idolizes William Faulkner. Toni Morrison's Beloved and Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, it's it's as good, and it's like Black Faulkner. It's like Southern Black Faulkner. And it's like um and I mean she's great and she comes after. But especially something like Beloved, which has, even it's even more, the modernism is toned a bit down, and
Yeah.
and like the magical realism is toned up, and it makes for these like inspiring stories. Go ahead.
I've only read Song of Solomon, and I haven't read Beloved, and I've actually like been, I don't know, kind of weaned away from it because of the perspective that it's got, because it's like people have very strong opinions about that book, and it's either it's the greatest work of the past 50 years, or that people say, or the complete opposite, which is like it's completely detracted from her better work.
I love it. And since you've read Song of Solomon, I would say, like, are you picking up what I'm putting down? Like Song of Solomon as like
100%,
these these characters in this environment. There's a folklore now that we're a Faulkner lore, now that we're talking about it. There's like this folklore and this deep culture and these characters filled with ironies and emotions. And but Beloved, just if you're doubting, rip the first chapter. You won't be able to stop.
I thought initially Beloved could be a good one for next year's book club, to be honest.
Yeah, that could be a good one.
It is. I like it a lot. It's beloved, one might say. Um, Thank you. That was pause for effect. But yeah, we still we still got Faulknerisms. Anybody got any more takes?
No, nothing's unfortunately gonna. I think we peaked with the folklore. We should have just ended it there, to be
Folklore.
honest.
Folklore. Yeah, we kind of did. We talked about James Franco and Toni Morrison only.
I think, yeah, no one's definitely got anything else. I think we can call it there, guys. That was sick, by the way. We can all jump over into the hangout and just chill for a little bit if we want. If that sounds good.
Let's do that.
Yeah. Right. Thanks to everyone who's staying, but I think most people are going to come over. Esteban, if you can hear this, thanks for recording as well. And now let's all do a mass migration to the other side.